Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Power and Parsha. This week is Parshat Vayechi, the last Torah portion in the book of Genesis. So this week we complete the first book of the Torah, the book of Bereshis, with Parshat Vayechi. Parshat Vayechi opens with the impending death of Jacob. Yaakov is about to pass away, and it's the end of his life. And he calls Joseph, and then he blesses Joseph and his sons, and then he calls in all his children. He blesses all his children. And then we read that Yaakov passes away, he's buried in Israel. And then we read about the end of the Parsha, and the end of the book of Genesis is the passing of all the 12 tribes. All of his 12 sons all pass away. The last verse tells us that Joseph passes away and is placed in a coffin in Egypt. And so concludes the book of Genesis, the book of Bereshis, which sets the tone for the coming week, next week, the second book, which opens with the beginning of the Jewish people's exile in Egypt. They're already in Egypt. Once that first generation passes away, now is when the exile starts to take place, and of course, the Exodus, and so on and so forth. At any rate, I want to focus on something from the beginning of the Parsha, where Yaakov calls Yosef. Yosef gets word that Yaakov is not well, and he's on his deathbed, and Yosef comes to his father, and Yaakov tells Yosef that he wants him to promise him that he will bury him in Israel, that he will not bury him in Egypt, but that he'll take his body up to Israel and bury him in the land of Israel, specifically in the cave of Machpelah, which is in Hebron, to be buried there with his ancestors. The cave of Machpelah is where Adam and Eve are buried, where Abraham and Sarah are buried, where Isaac and Rebekah, Yitzchak and Rivka are buried, and where Yaakov had buried his wife Leah. And Yaakov wants to be buried there with his ancestors. So he makes Joseph swear that he will take his body up to be buried in Israel. And here we read something very interesting in the beginning of the Parsha, where Yaakov says to Yosef, he says, when I was coming from Padan, this is in chapter 48, verse 7. When I was coming from Padan, my wife Rachel, who was Joseph's mother, died on me on the way as I was going, and I didn't have a chance to bring her into town to Bethlehem to bury her in town. I buried her there on the side of the road, B'derech Efrat, on the road to Efrat, which is Bethlehem, Beis Lechem. So what is happening here? Why is this? Where does this verse come from? Right? How does Yaakov enter into this conversation by talking about Joseph's mother's death? So Rashi fills in the blanks and fills in the conversation. He says, here's Yaakov. He's asking Yosef to take him up to bury him in the land of Israel, and that would be a whole production. You'd have to take leave, maybe some sick days from running the government, and he'd have to get special permits and permission, and be a whole journey up to the land of Israel to take his father up to be buried in Israel. So this is it would be a big detailed funeral procession to go up to bury him there. Not so convenient. And Yaakov is saying to himself that if he is asking Yosef to do this, he feels like, what would be the first thing that would come to Yosef's mind? Well, Yosef would think, my mother passed away, and you didn't even bother to go off to the side, get off of the road, and just bury her in a nearby civilized area in a proper cemetery. You just buried her on the side of the road, just like that. You didn't bother to take her body anywhere. You just right where she was. So seemingly without much dignity, right, and consideration for her. So that's how you treated my mother, and you want me then not only to not just bury you on the side of the road, but to take you all the way up to Israel, this great burden. That's a big ask. So Yaakov says he before he gets into this with Yosef, he prefaces it by saying that I feel like you're probably holding a grudge against me and wondering why I did that. So I want you to know that I didn't do that because I wasn't interested. I couldn't be bothered. I did it because that's what God wanted me to do. God instructed me to do that. Why? Because being buried where she was buried, it would serve a purpose that eventually, in centuries later, when the Jewish people, after settling the land of Israel, will be banished from the land of Israel, and they'll be sent into exile, they will pass by her grave. And when the Jewish people are passing the grave of Rachel, of Rachel, on their way into exile, into an unknown future, amid great devastation and confusion, she will come out from her resting place and go up on high and pray to God and ask God to have mercy on her children. So she will pray for them and pray for their safe return to the land. So that's why I did it. It was God who wanted me to bury her there, and it's for a very good reason, so that she can be there for her children. So that's the story. That's what Yaakov tells Yosef. Then he says, "But I'm not in that kind of position. I'm going to, but I'm asking you to bury me in the land of Israel." Now we know that there's a great value in being buried in the land of Israel. It's a very holy place, obviously. Plenty of people to this day, people that pay top dollar to be buried in Israel. It's a great merit, and certainly for him to be buried in this holy site of the Maras Machpelah in Hebron, to be buried there is certainly a great honor and privilege. So even though God tells Yaakov, instructs him, as Yaakov tells his son, to bury her there, to be there for her children, at the same time, she forgoes this benefit of being buried in a proper burial plot and place among very holy, special people. She's there sort of all alone. So why is that Rachel's the one who's there all alone? And also, what is it that it's Rachel specifically, Rachel, who's the one who prays for us in exile? Medrash says that when the Jewish people are being exiled and being massacred, so the souls of the righteous on high start making a big commotion, start praying for them, and nobody can seem to get God's attention. And suddenly Rachel emerges. It's a very moving passage in the Midrash. It says that suddenly Rachel appears and cries for her children, and suddenly God pays attention, God takes note. And it's Rachel who God listens to. In fact, it's interesting. We have our patriarchs and our matriarchs, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the three patriarchs. Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel are the four matriarchs. And the reason we call them our patriarchs and matriarchs is because just like your parents, you are made up of your parents' DNA. You come from your parents, and you inherit naturally by birth, biologically, their characteristics. So too, we have elements from all of our patriarchs. That's why they're the avot and the imahot, our patriarchs and matriarchs. But it's interesting that Rachel is not, when we talk about the matriarchs, so yes, we are every born Jew is a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Every born Jew is a descendant of Sarah and Rebecca, but not every born Jew is a descendant of Leah or Rachel. If you came from the tribes of Joseph or Benjamin, then your matriarch is Rachel, is Rachel. And if you didn't come from those two tribes, you came from the other 10 tribes, you had a different mother, right? Leah was the mother of only 6 of the tribes, right? But half of Yaakov's children were not her biological children. And 10 of Yaakov's biological children weren't Rachel's biological children. Yet somehow Leah and Rachel are the matriarchs, considered the mothers of all of the Jewish people. So what is it that Rachel is considered the matriarch, even though the majority of Jewish people are not really descended directly from her? Yet the fact that she is our matriarch tells us that we inherit something from her as well, right? So there's something that we inherit from her. What can we learn from Rachel? And why is it that she specifically prays for all her children, meaning all of the Jewish people? And how does that relate to what we're talking about? So the truth is, there's an issue. We have a bit of a contradiction. Here, from Parshas Vayechi, the implication is that, well, not the implication, the commentaries tell us that God instructs Yaakov to bury Rachel where he buried her so that she can serve to defend her children. So, in other words, the fact that she was buried on the side of the road where she was buried, where she is to this day, is a good thing, it's a positive thing. So she can come to the aid and the defense of her children, plead and pray on their behalf that they return home safely to their borders. But if we go back a few weeks to Parshat Vayechi, if you look back in Bereshis in chapter 30, verses 14 and 15, we read an interesting story. There we read about Reuven, Leah's oldest son, who went out into the field and he gathered what some translate as mandrakes, dudaim. He gathered dudaim, these flowers, wild flowers that he gathered for his mother, brought it to his mother, Leah. Rachel sees Leah with these flowers and she wants these flowers. And she asks Leah to give her the flowers. And Leah is not so pleased. And she says, first you take my husband, right? Because Yaakov loved Rachel. Leah felt scorned. And so you take my husband. Now you also want the flowers of my child. You just want to take everything from me. Which is a harsh kind of statement. But anyway, Rachel says, yeah, you know what? I'll buy them from you. How is she going to buy them? She said, tonight is my night to be with my husband, to be with Yaakov. I'll exchange him for the flowers. You give me the flowers and I'll give you my husband for the night. And so they make this exchange. And in fact, that night when Yaakov comes home, Leah goes out and says, hey, you're with me tonight. You're coming to my tent tonight because I rented you for my son's flowers, right? And then that night, Leah becomes pregnant, right? And she has a son. She names him Yisachar, right? Because she had sort of rented Yaakov for that for in that exchange. Okay, so what's happening here? In fact, if you look at Rashi here, when Rachel says to Leah that on as payment for your son's flowers, you'll have my husband tonight. Rashi comments and says, again, fills in the blanks and says he was supposed to be with me tonight, but I'll give him to you tonight. You can have him tonight. And then Rashi continues and says that since Rachel was zilzala, which sort of means because she seemed to be indifferent, blasé about her, or didn't really value the time that she would have that night with her husband, because she sort of was dismissive of it. So therefore, she didn't merit to be buried with him. So it seems from here, though, that why was Rachel buried inside the road? Why didn't she merit to be buried in the cave of the patriarchs together with her husband Yaakov? Is because she didn't value laying with him. So because she didn't value laying with him in their lifetime, she wasn't going to lay with him in the afterlife. She wasn't going to lay for eternity together in the cave of Machpelah. So it seems to be a negative thing that Rachel didn't end up in the cave of Machpelah and Hebron as sort of a punishment, you might say, for not valuing being with her husband. Well, how do you square that with what Yaakov tells Yosef, that actually the reason she's not there is because she can come to the rescue of her children, and clearly in a way that nobody else would be able to. That's why she had to be buried inside the road. How do we square these two? So the commentaries explain about these dudaim. Rabbeinu Bachia brings it, and I think in others as well. The mandrake, that it's an herb that grows, and its roots are like sort of the shape of a human being, of the human body, and it was believed back in the day that these herbs were like a sort of a fertility potion, and they were good for fertility. And so we know that Rachel, at this time of this interaction with Leah over the flowers, she was barren. She didn't have children, and she was desperate for children, but she wasn't having children. And so she wanted to have some kind of fertility treatment. She thought maybe she could do something that will enhance that ability for her to have children. When she sees Leah with these flowers, she says, perfect, these are flowers that will help me maybe get pregnant. Now, she knew at that point that she wanted children more than anything else. So rather than be with her husband, she felt she'll give everything away, even her husband, the love of life. You think about Rachel. She had nothing. All she had was her husband, Yaakov, and his love. That's all she had, right? She had no children. Being surrounded by women who had children, it had to have been a very lonely feeling. And the only place she could find comfort and solace is with her husband, who loved her more than anything else. And yet she was willing to give all of that up, risk all of that in order to try and get pregnant, to have a child, because that's what she wanted more than anything, was to bring children into the world. And so Rachel, during that in this interaction, says that's the most important thing for me, is to be able to have children, to birth children, and to raise them, bring them up into the world, that I'm willing to give everything away for that. This is why, at that moment, God says, as it were, that this woman's commitment to having children, putting that value above all else, she's the one who's going to be able to come to the defense of the Jewish people. That her care and concern for the Jewish people was so great that she's willing to risk everything and lose everything just to bring a Jewish child into the world. And we see that, by the way, play out later when she has her first child. Eventually, she has a son, Joseph. So maybe these mandrakes, maybe these flowers actually worked. She has a son, and the first thing she says, she's praying for another son. Yosef, the name Yosef is implying she's praying for Yosef Hashem li benach. I want another child. That's what she wanted, to bring children into the world. It's just that moment that God says, wow, more than your own personal fulfillment and your own personal happiness and even your own spiritual pursuits, you want more than that. You want children. That's somebody who's so committed. That's somebody whose love of their children is so great. It's a reflection, in a sense, really, of God's love for the Jewish people. And so she's the one who can come to their defense. When she cries for the Jewish people, God takes note. And so what happens is that Leah exchanges Yaakov for the flowers. Rachel has the flowers so that it can hopefully help her with her fertility, so she can have children. And it's that moment that she risks it all that God says, yeah, she's not going to be buried with Yaakov. I need her for something much more important, much more vital, which is to be there crying for the Jewish people. And this is why, as we said earlier, Rachel is the mother of all the Jewish people, our mother Rachel, because she embodies the spirit of the Jewish mother. She embodies this value, this idea that has been imparted to her daughters since that first moment, to be there for our children, to cry for our children, to value life and raising the future generations, the future people, and future of the Jewish people above everything else. That's why when a mother cries, God listens, God hears, because of this inheritance that we have from our matriarch Rachel. And so this is what Yaakov tells Yosef. He says, you might think that I was indifferent. I wasn't indifferent. I also would have preferred to be buried with your mother, but your mother was so special. She was so great that she was willing to lay on the side of the road for 1,000 years so that when her children pass by, she can cry for them. She's the greatest advocate. She's their greatest defender up in heaven. And ever since that day, she hasn't stopped coming out to cry as countless children of hers are exiled and banished and hounded, kidnapped, taken from their land. She cries and cries, and we pray for the words of the prophet to be fulfilled, where God finally says to Rachel, and finally hears her and answers her and says, no need to cry anymore. Your children are coming home. Thanks for joining.